Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. For people who have joined us from all over the world, welcome to the fourth webinar in this series on reimagining groundwater governance with a focus on India. I'm Siddharth Patil. I work as a hydrogeologist with Aquadam, and I'll be moderating today. So. Some of my other colleagues are also helping facilitate this. So the entire Aqua team is involved in this webinar. Now, I will, in very short, the design of this webinar is such that we'll have 4 speakers in the beginning. Each speaker will talk for 10 minutes, followed by a question and answer session for 20 minutes. Post the question and answer session for the speakers, we'll have a panel discussion, and there will be question and answers again for the panel discussion. So with this design in mind, we'll quickly begin now. And to begin, I would like to make a short presentation on behalf of Aquadam on today's theme. Yes, so today's theme is about today's theme is basically about an alternative paradigm for groundwater governance for the future. So, I would like to present Aquadam's view for this particular aspect. So, before I get into the theme for today, just quick highlights of the 3 webinars that we have had in the previous weeks. And these are really very short, very crisp highlights. There's been a lot of learning which has happened, and we are going to compile it in the form of a report. But if we were to look at 3 or 4 very important findings, then learnings, then the first one is basically that there are tremendous contrasts in the way in which practitioners and policymakers perceive groundwater governance. A top-down approach is highly rigid. So while policymakers are still looking at a command and control approach, practitioners are looking at, as one of our speakers in the previous webinars put it, looking at more of a caring and sharing approach which is required. There is a need to embrace social and biophysical diversities. More on this later, but this is one point which has come out very strongly, not just in India, across the world. Another strong point was the interplay between surface and groundwater resources at local and regional scales. So, there were views where some people felt that, you shouldn't look at this as separate, look at it as a common system. There were some views which said, yes, we need to look at both of these resources, but, given the inherent differences, you also need to understand the resources differently. And finally, another major highlight of the previous 3 webinars has been the challenges of disciplinary barriers, especially the science of people's behavior. So now, with that in mind, if we were to now look at, what is an alternative paradigm? What are the lenses through which we need to consider an alternative paradigm for groundwater governance? Then just listed out some of the different aspects, the context of groundwater, again, largely from an Indian perspective, but I'm sure this is applicable anywhere in the world. So there's social and geographical, the diversity aspect. Then there's also the whole concept of wells and springs regions where groundwater is tapped through these 2 major different sources of groundwater. And then, we need to look at livelihoods and food, energy, which is an emerging, very important aspect related to groundwater. Now, command areas from an Indian subcontinent perspective, lots of large dams, lots of, structures and watershed development. So command areas in groundwater. There's a lot of groundwater discussions in India have largely been focused in the rural context, but urban groundwater is also an important aspect which is now coming up. River basins, this point also came in the previous webinars. Ecosystems, again, a very important aspect. And finally, political economy, because although there are so many different contexts, the political economy becomes very important and a very major controlling factor when it comes to policies and practice on the ground. Now, further, just contextualizing things, the atomistic nature of groundwater, which is so inherent in in India and the subcontinent overall. Uh, this is a factor which is very, very important while talking about developing, groundwater governance mechanisms. Then, when we talk about groundwater as a resource, it is naturally iniquitous, and this inequity in the system, in the natural system, cannot solely be addressed through engineering and technology, and will require a very different approach than what is taken in when we talk about surface water. A lot of the focus when we talk about groundwater governance essentially, boils down to talking about agriculture and farmers, but there is also a need to discuss the ecosystem linkages, natural disasters, climate change, etc., when we are talking about groundwater governance. Now, there can be a debate about whether you embed groundwater governance within a river basin framework or keep it separate, but uh, there is no debate on whether we need groundwater governance or not. And finally, I'd like to share some points on what Aquadam as an organization has been trying to do in developing this alternative paradigm. So first and foremost, democratization of groundwater governance. Again, a point which has come in the previous webinars through different speakers and panelists. So, governing groundwater at the lowest level of administration through various instruments, not just formal regulation, but there's a lot of other social instruments also possible for governance. And community inclusive groundwater governance, governing this resource as a common pool, as a CPR, as a common pool resource. And to this end, Aquadam has been leading an effort which is formally known as participatory groundwater management, which in which we focus on agencies which are working on water across different thematics. So there can be agencies working on drinking water, sanitation, livelihoods, agriculture, etc. So we focus on enhancing their capacities to embed groundwater governance within their own thematic. Another important aspect which came in the previous webinars, but which is also a very important aspect of PGWM, of community inclusive governance, is the information, education, and communication as a means of changing behavior. Now, this becomes important because the final point that I want to put forth here is that how do we narrow the gap between natural systems? Yeah, because when it comes to groundwater, we are talking about aquifers. So how do we narrow the gap between aquifers and human behavior? So, there's a natural system, and then which is dynamic, and there is human behavior. So information, education, and communication as a means to narrow this gap and govern this resource sustainably. So with that, I will end my this small bit of information that I wanted to share. Now, we'll basically begin the webinar, and just give me a moment. Yeah. So we will basically begin now, and I will now invite the speakers to make their presentations. I'll first invite, uh, uh, before I invite the speakers, just some basic norms that we'd like to follow. I would request everyone to please keep their mics on mute. and turn on their video only when they are speaking. Uh, all uh, Post the speaker sessions, we will have a question and answer session. So all the participants can put in their questions in the Q&A section that is provided in the software. If there are any, it would be great if you can direct your questions at specific speakers. So please mention the speaker for whom the speaker or panelist for whom your question is, if possible. And if there are any other specific comments, they can be put in the chat box. Now, we won't be in order to save time, we won't be introducing each speaker or panelist in detail. Their introductions will be put in the chat box for everyone's reference. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Paul Pavlich. He is a senior researcher with the International Water Management Institute. And yeah, Paul.
Thanks, Siddharth. Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen and hear my voice.
Yes, we can hear your voice. We can see your screen very well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and talk to you today about conservation and recharge as part of groundwater governance, with an emphasis on the recharge part of this statement. And when we think about recharge augmentation, it's hard to think about countries that go past India in terms of the richness of experience in various forms of aquifer recharge. So I'm really delighted to be here to be contributing to that topic, particularly in the Indian context. The outline for the presentation will cover 4 particular topics. One is to present to you a series of solutions to groundwater governance challenges. Secondly, I'd like to present a particular form of managed aquifer recharge, or MAR, suited to flood-prone settings, and look at the broader opportunities for that. And then finish off with looking at the transferability of these solutions from one region to the other. So this schematic here illustrates that we really have in our toolkit a whole host of different types of technologies and approaches for perhaps not reimagining, but certainly improving the state of groundwater governance in India and South Asia as a whole. These different techniques shown within this blue vessel here come out of an analysis that we did for the World Bank a couple of years back, and basically we've been able to demonstrate the pros and the cons of these approaches, and the opportunities for scaling them out and transferring them elsewhere. And they come in various types of forms and for various types of rationales, be it preserving the groundwater resource or developing techniques for ensuring water for the poor and poverty alleviation. But for this particular presentation here, I'd like to focus on the topic shown at the bottom of this blue vessel, humid MAR, and that's what we'll be talking about next. So this form of MAR, which we call UTFI or UTIFY, which is the acronym for Underground Transfer of Floods for Irrigation, really emerged as an idea about a decade ago, recognizing that MAR had generally been applied in a fairly localized nature, particularly in the Indian context, in drought-prone areas with very finicky and scarce groundwater resources. And we wanted to explore opportunities for applying MAR at a larger scale to address both seasonal flooding, groundwater depletion, and drought simultaneously. And the schematic on the left illustrates the basic premise of the idea that you can offset the flooding that would occur downstream if you're able to capture that water upstream and divert it into the underground to replenish underground resources. And the innovative parts of this are shown in, highlighted in the text there, in terms of the nature-based solution with which this can be characterized, and its potential for providing an alternative, more passive mode of storage. Now, how do you turn this idea into mainstream practice and reality? Well, firstly, you've got to develop a strong scientific case for this Utify, looking at the performance and the acceptance and the sustainability of this type of approach. Having established that, you've got to look at the opportunities for scaling this out beyond the experimental type of scale. And the type of integrated approaches that we've used to evaluate this pilot are shown in the text there. Basically, we're looking at biophysical techniques, social, gender, institutional, and environmental types of analyses to really come up with that evidence-based case. And the large map that you see in the middle is where we piloted this Utify. We chose the Ganges Basin, and specifically the Gangetic Plain in India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And after a detailed site selection process, we settled upon a village in the west of Uttar Pradesh, where we converted a village pond, a community-owned village pond, into a recharge augmentation scheme, harvesting water from the Ramganga River, which is a major tributary of the Ganges River, and putting that into a depleted aquifer. And the type of design that we applied at this particular pilot is shown in the schematics on the right of the screen. And you can see in the photographs the situation in the pond before and after our piloting began. I'll present you some hydraulic results here. We monitored the pilot for 3 years, from 2016 to 2018. And I'm showing here the water level response in the piezometers around the recharge scheme, and the water quality in terms of the total suspended solid content and the recharge rates. And you'll see here, oh, excuse me, my screen has gone blank. I'll try to bring it back. I hope you
I think we may have lost him. Let's just give him a couple of minutes to rejoin. Yes, we've lost him, so it's most probably a connectivity issue, but let's just wait for a couple of minutes again to.
Can we call him and check, Siddharth?
Yes, on it. We're just trying.
We can see him in the video.
No, I think he's dropped.
His face is there and he's moving, so I don't know what the problem is.
No, he's dropped off the the list, the panelist list is completely dropped off.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So Siddharth, maybe we'll just wait. I think Siddharth is calling me. Just wait for a minute.
Hello, this is
Paul?
Paul.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm back. I'm terribly sorry about that. My computer crashed. Siddharth, what do you recommend we do?
Just pick up from where you dropped. We realized it was a technology issue, so we've been waiting for you to rejoin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your patience. 1 second, I'll get the presentation back.
Yeah, your screen is visible. Please just proceed.
Excellent. Okay, so a couple of minutes ago, we were talking about the hydraulic results from the pilot, and now you can see the water level response in piezometers situated at different distances from the recharge pond. And on the right-hand side, you can see the volumetric totals of water introduced into the aquifer, into the alluvial aquifer at the site over the 3 years. And we can transfer these volumes into the amount of water that could be irrigated during the dry season, during the Rabi. If it was wheat, it would be 10 hectares of irrigated land. And at the village scale, the amount of water that we've been able to recharge is quite modest, at about 2 to 4% of the natural recharge within that village area. We've also looked at the water quality in extensive detail, because this is one of the critical issues that needs to be investigated, and to ensure that any risks are identified and managed properly. So we've characterized the recharge water, the water we introduced into the underground, and the groundwater, both within close proximity to the recharge structure, which could be potentially affected by the recharging process, and far groundwater, which you see in the columns on the right-hand side, which we know aren't affected by the recharging process. And we've also characterized the parameters in terms of the percent exceedance against the Indian standards for groundwater quality. So the basic message here is that neither the groundwater nor the recharge water is particularly pristine, and there's exceedances in particular heavy metals and microbial parameters for all cases for the recharge water near and far groundwater. But the main message here is that we've created no detrimental impact on the groundwater quality, even though it's compromised both in surface water and groundwater at this site. We've been engaging with various stakeholders at multiple levels, from the local scale right through to the national scale, over the duration of the pilot, to basically demystify what Utify is, and to ensure that the scheme is operated effectively, and so on and so forth. So at the village scale, there's been good acceptance of the concept by the community. They permitted the trial, they participated, and they're actually engaged in a paid for work scheme called NREGA, in which the villagers each year worked to desilt the ponds. At this district scale, with the district officials, we had close interaction, and ultimately at the end of the pilot trial, we handed the trial over to the district authorities who now manage the pilot on an ongoing basis. At the state level, the government of Uttar Pradesh has embedded this approach of Utify in the district irrigation plan for Rampur district, which provides a next level scaling of the pilot in these coming years. And at the national level, there's been endorsement from various ministries, including the Ministry of Water Resources. We recognise that the potential impacts that can be achieved at the pilot are quite modest. So we also looked at the opportunities at the river basin scale. So in this case here, it's the Ramganga basin of about 19,000 square kilometres, the boundary of which is shown by the red line in the map at the top right-hand corner. And we recognise that there are thousands of village ponds across the basin with great potential to replicate this type of pilot across the basin. So what we wanted to see was, could you actually make a difference to the groundwater levels and to the flood risks if you were to replicate this significantly? So we looked at different scenarios with an integrated surface groundwater model, different scenarios of development ranging from nothing through to 50% harvesting of the surface water that exits from the basin into the Ganges. So what we found is that interventions of around about 20% of the discharge or more could reverse the falling groundwater trends that are evident across this area and significantly reduce the drought risk, as evident by the increase in the return period for major flooding events.
Quick time check, Paul.
Thanks. How many minutes do I have left, Siddharth?
Maybe a minute more.
Okay. Just briefly to let you know that we've mapped out the potential for Utify at the global scale, and you see by the areas in green, there's vast potential in all the continents, covering around about 40% of the cropped area, and also some of the lessons that we've learned from India, we've translated to Vietnam, specifically the Central Highlands in Vietnam, where there's emerging groundwater depletion issues and actually no experience in managed aquifer recharge, who were able to apply some of the techniques that are used in hard rock India for the first time in the highlands. They're quite successfully as a series of pilots, and the government of Vietnam appreciated this and replicated our experiments with a government-led effort, just to show that the ideas that apply in one area can be sometimes be used in places and in ways that may not have been intuitive at first. And all the material that I've presented in this staggered presentation is published, and I'm just giving you some of the key references here if you'd like to read up more about what I've shown in very abbreviated form. Thanks for your attention, and I'll close the presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So thank you for a wonderful presentation. There are some questions for you, so you could decide to answer them live, or in the chat, in the question and answer box, or we can take them up once we finish with all the speakers' presentations. So our next speaker is Professor Basant Maheshwari, who has a rich experience in research, teaching, and consulting. Yeah.
Just sorry to interrupt. Maybe what we can do is, given the constraint of time, and given that Basant has sent a recorded video, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So maybe we could play that at the end, and we'll actually sort of resequence this. We'll get the speakers who are here to present first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll proceed with Professor Margaret, who is currently the Professor of Water Governance at IIT Delft Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands. So, Marguerite, I would request you to share your screen and your presentation.
Thanks, Siddharth. And thanks, Aquadam, for inviting me to speak in this webinar and to be part of this exciting and inspiring webinar series. It's an immense privilege. So far, I have greatly enjoyed and learned from the previous episodes of the webinar series. And what I think worked particularly well for me was the mix of presenters, with some coming from a scientific background and others with a more practitioner or activist background. And I also enjoyed that the speakers represented a wide range of geographical areas. I think this plurality of voices and perspective is extremely enriching, and is also rare and much needed. And I'll use my presentation today to explain why. But before I start, I need to make clear that almost everything I say here is the outcome of a journey of joint learning and reflecting with all the members of a project that I am part of, and the project is called Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability. I'll say a bit more about that later. It's funded by the Belmont Norface program on transformations to sustainability, and Aquadam is a prominent member of the project, just as Sopacom. It's partly because of COVID-19 that I myself have hardly spent any time in the field to study or learn about groundwater, which means that almost everything that I'm speaking about today or that I've learned comes from listening to and learning from others. And these others indeed prominently include the members from the Aquadam and Sopacom teams in India. So a lot of credit goes to them. And then also before, let me then start and explain why it is important to, in my opinion, to multiply and pluralize voices and knowledges in groundwater governance. And first of all, and perhaps the easiest and most obvious reason, and many of the previous presenters have emphasized this, is that there is an enormous diversity of groundwater situations. Some presenters have made reference to geological and hydrological differences. Others have emphasized social, political, and economic variations. The effect of this diversity is not just that every groundwater situation is specific and unique, but, and this is the point of my presentation, also that any attempt to compare groundwater cases across places or any generalization from specificities inevitably entails simplifications and conceptual choices. It foregrounds some dimensions and makes others disappear into the background, or it helps give some explanations and solutions gain prominence to the neglect of others. For instance, is over-extraction caused by the greedy pumping behavior of individuals, or is it the logical effect of a market-based economy that prioritizes profits over livelihoods and ecosystems, or a combination of both? No need to say that the choice of assumptions or how one compares and generalizes has important political effects, as it informs proposals for solutions. So reflective awareness of this is important. And this reflective awareness calls for not nurturing active suspicion against all proclamations of truth about groundwater that come as if from an unidentified nowhere, a position outside of reality, or from an anonymous we. I'll say a bit more about that later. My argument now is, if we agree and accept that groundwater situations are enormously diverse, nor any way of comparing or generalizing will ever capture the whole. This is why it becomes important to cherish multiple ways of comparing and generalizing multiple ways of knowing, allowing to register many different geological, hydrological, cultural, political, etc. configurations, and celebrating multiple explanations for observed phenomena and dynamics. Unfortunately, almost the opposite seems to be happening. Global groundwater initiatives that abound seem premised on a desire for and belief in universal diagnosis and singular visions, with theorizations that both demand and enforce equivalence, commensuration, and coherence across cases. Indeed, recent reviews of groundwater scholarship reveal a striking uniformity in how groundwater governance is imagined and conceptualized. With a few exceptions, many of which come from India, most groundwater governance thinking is resource-oriented, displaying a clear legacy of engineering or natural science-based approaches, consider groundwater as an optimizable input to production, food or profit, separate and separable from wider livelihood and ecosystem context. They are also often intervention-oriented, with a sometimes implicit assumption that governing groundwater is primarily a public concern. Studies often identify with those expected or assumed to be responsible for governance, mostly government agencies, even though the success of state efforts to curb depletion is minimal. A lot of groundwater governance thinking is geared towards the formulation of generic recipes or guidelines, often supported by the belief that natural hydrogeological similarities dictate how institutional regulation should be done. And they place a lot of faith in the use of ever more advanced modeling and remote sensing techniques to better know and monitor groundwater levels, based on the assumption that better numbers will almost automatically lead to better management. In addition, most existing groundwater governance scholarship treats the main cause of over-extraction, agricultural intensification, as mere context, as a given. What is also striking is the dominance of a particular group of international water experts in producing groundwater governance knowledge. Many of them are part of this webinar series as presenters or panelists. They are, one could say, old epistemic friends who share a long history of developing, promoting, and circulating a particular body of water knowledge. Knowledge that is often closely linked to water projects and management interventions in developing countries funded by development cooperation money. It is also knowledge that is clearly dominated by the disciplines of engineering and economics. I am saying all this not to say that this knowledge is wrong per se, but just to show that conventional groundwater governance scholarship and scholars, again, I also need to emphasize that there are also unconventional scholars, and many of them come from India and were also part of the webinar series. But a lot of scholarship and many scholars, this scholarship has a distinct epistemic history and stems from or is associated with distinct political projects of water development that can be characterized as projects of empire and colonization, and that are part of a particular models of development as economic growth. As some earlier speakers, Tima and Joy in particular, have highlighted, this project is a project that is premised on undervaluing the labor of some people, many of whom are women, and that of ecosystems. I find it telling that conventional groundwater governance knowledge fails to acknowledge how the intensification of groundwater use entailed far-reaching redistributions of water, with some benefiting at the expense of many others.
Time check.
Groundwater.
Sorry,
Governance.
just a quick time check for you. 2 minutes left.
Okay. Oh, then okay. Groundwater governance, therefore, is not objective. It is in the positive sense of the word term. It comes from somewhere and it comes from some people. It's linked to particular agendas and normative visions of development, etc. Tracing and exposing this is important. It's important as a form of critique, but also because it creates space for developing alternatives. In our project, Transformations to Groundwater Sustainability, we look for inspirations for such alternatives in grassroots community-based initiatives in a number of countries. These initiatives consist of people organizing around the sharing and or protecting of groundwater in places where threats of depletion are particularly high. They're often anchored in a strong sense of territorial belonging or a connection to place. Their existence seems to counter narratives of the tragedy of the commons. Whether they indeed represent examples of more environmentally sustainable or socially equitable forms of groundwater governance is precisely the question that we want to answer. One such initiative is Randulabat, a community that has banned the drilling of deep tube wells. Another is that of the pozas in Peru, a traditional irrigation method consisting of small ponds that store both canal and rainwater. And yet another is that of the circular irrigation system in the Mzab Valley in the oasis of Algeria. I can say a lot more about these initiatives, and for those interested, I would like to encourage you to have a look at our project website. Here, what I would like to say, what matters is that the existence of these initiatives provides an interesting comparison and contrast to more conventional imaginaries and knowledges, helping bring into relief the beliefs, norms, logics, and ontologies that underpin and inform both. Hence, where conventional groundwater governance wisdom continues to assume the controllability of water, farmers engaged in the studied initiative seem much more accepting of surprises. They have learned to live with the capriciousness of water. Rather than masterful control, their governance style is perhaps better characterized as one of tinkering care. This care for each other and for their environment sometimes comes with ritualized forms of respect for water and nature more widely, anchored in cosmologies that emphasize mutuality, conviviality, and codependence, rather than individual interests and profits. Many involved in these initiatives underscore and actively uphold the importance of principles of solidarity and care in organizing life.
Sorry, Margaret, again, a time check.
This is my last slide. This is my last. Let me just end. Let me end my presentation by repeating and summarizing 3 components of my proposal for doing and knowing groundwater differently. The first component is make visible how existing approaches, norms, institutions, technologies, knowledges are colonial or show their colonial roots. Show that they are not universal or neutral, objective, but always local and situated, in that they stem from distinct histories of knowing, distinct epistemic communities, and are often linked to distinct political projects of empire and colonization. This provincialization, this is the second component, helps create space for recognizing other ways of doing and knowing water, replacing universe with pluriverse, comparing and contrasting methods to help bring into relief the beliefs, norms, logics, ontologies that underpin and inform them. And then the third component is hybridizing these knowledges or developing what I call two-eyed seeing. Engage in scientific political processes to imagine and discuss new ways to organize groundwater society relations, ways of knowing, accessing and sharing it, and making explicit how they are linked to different projects and visions.
Thank you for a very detailed presentation in short. So again, we'll take questions after all the speakers have spoken, but there are some questions in the Q&A which you could try and answer. I mean, again, your choice. You could answer them later, or you could type in the answers right now. So I'll invite our next speaker, who's Dr. Mihir Shah. Dr. Mihir Shah is a co-founder of an organization, Samaj Pragati Sahyog, where he's actually spent the last 3 decades living and working in remote central tribal India. He is also, incidentally, the youngest member of the Planning Commission, Government of India, where he was holding the portfolios of water resources, rural development, and Panchayati Raj. So, Dr. Shah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. And first, heartiest congratulations to Aquadam for having put together such an extraordinary webinar. I mean, I think you have collected all the great minds and practitioners on groundwater across the globe. And it's an achievement for which I want to really congratulate my friend, Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, and his extraordinary team of young workers. So well done, Aquadam. And I also want to mention that we've had such an extraordinary presentation by my dear friend, Margaret. I was really looking forward to listening to her, but this was absolutely mind-blowing. And, you know, you have set, in a sense, the context for me to make the observations that I had thought I would make. And, you know, so many of your observations actually resonate with what I want to say today. So if I may continue from where Margaret left off, if we accept, as I do, almost everything that she said in her presentation, in terms of perspective, in terms of how we understand groundwater in the context of groundwater, what I thought I would focus on today is, as advocates of a different approach, of a different paradigm for management of groundwater, for governance of groundwater, what is it that we need to keep in mind, but don't always, while doing advocacy for groundwater, and not just in India, but across the globe? Because I think it's extremely important for us to come across in a way that the primary stakeholders of groundwater can fully understand. We come across in a way which resonates with their own experience of groundwater. As Margaret was emphasizing, they have enormous knowledge, having worked with groundwater, having depended on groundwater. So what is it that we can do to communicate effectively so that once the stakeholders are convinced, the primary users of groundwater are convinced about what we are trying to say, they would actually put the pressure on policymakers, because the policymakers on groundwater are deeply accountable to the primary users of groundwater. That is the only way in which we can hope to effect a paradigm shift in groundwater, which is something a lot of us have been working on, but it's a really uphill task. And so I thought what I could do is to try and highlight a few key points which I thought we need to keep in mind. So I'll just begin with the proposition which Margaret has very well illustrated already, with the statement, what does he know of groundwater who only groundwater knows? We must understand that all policy, all programs related to groundwater have a deep connection with a number of frameworks which are integrally linked to groundwater. And I just want to put forward 3 frameworks for you to consider. This is a very tentative formulation. I have particularly tried to work this out for this workshop, and it's very initial, and I'm sure the extraordinary audience we have today with some of the best minds and practitioners of groundwater could actually try and, you know, embellish this further, modify it, etc. So the 3 frameworks broadly that I wanted to put forward, and which I'll try and elaborate in this presentation. The first one is the biophysical. The second one is the framework of users. And the third is the framework of support structures. And I will elaborate each of these: biophysical framework, the framework of users of groundwater, and the framework of the support structures which are supposed to actually help in managing and governing groundwater properly. And while we examine these frameworks, and pardon my slightly complicated presentation, which I'm not sure whether I'll be able to do justice to it, what we need to do is to build into these three frameworks the essential characteristics of groundwater. Because, sometimes we say you can't manage what you can't measure. But I think what is much more useful to say is that you can't manage what you don't understand. If you do not understand the essential features of something, how are you able to devise the right policies for managing or governing that resource or that, element that you are trying to build policy for? So what are the essential features of groundwater, which I wanted to highlight? And, again, this can be elaborated further. The first, obviously, that it's a finite resource. So finitude of a resource which is, of course, renewable, but it still remains finite. The second, that it's a common pool resource. It's by definition a shared resource. And therefore, a lot of what Margaret was saying becomes so important, because we need to therefore understand how our management strategies have gone and what needs to change in that. The third feature is the interconnectedness of groundwater with other elements of the water cycle. And the fourth, again, which Margaret was emphasizing very correctly, is the diversity in the occurrence of groundwater. So these four features, I will try and weave them into the three frameworks that I put forward before you. And so let me begin without losing any more time. So if you look at the biophysical framework within which groundwater exists, the most important element, again, which has been emphasized by earlier speakers, is the catchment areas within which groundwater occurs. And it is absolutely clear that what happens in these catchment areas, from which water is being drawn, which fills the aquifers, which characterize those catchments, what we do with the catchment areas will determine the depth and the quality of the groundwater. And unfortunately, in all our policies regarding water or regarding the management of watersheds, we have just not adequately emphasized the proper management and governance of our catchment areas. The best work on water across the world is happening where we are recognizing the ecosystem services being provided by people who live in the catchment areas of our aquifers and our rivers. And unless we therefore build effective policies for incentivizing the management of our catchments in order to ensure that the catchments are not beset with the kind of destructive economic activities as we see most strikingly in the Himalayas, but we also see in Kerala and the southern states. So it's actually a pervasive problem. And we have just neglected the catchment areas, because of which we have endangered aquifers and therefore the availability of groundwater. So the interconnectedness feature of groundwater, which I was mentioning, comes out most clearly when we see the relationship between the catchment areas and groundwater. It also comes out in the relationship between groundwater and the river systems. River systems, are typically both fed and feed into our aquifer systems. And if we want to look at the single most important reason for especially the peninsular rivers in India drying up, it is the over-extraction of groundwater in their catchment areas. So once again, if we do not understand the interconnectedness between what we do with our river systems and how we manage groundwater, we are just not going to be able to tackle or propose the right protocols for the management and governance of groundwater. Because there is shortage of time, we can keep elaborating these elements, but I will go to the second framework, which I'm calling the framework of the users of groundwater. Now, this, I believe, is probably the most important reason why aquifers across the world, especially in India, are in tatters today. Because the primary user of groundwater in India especially, and in fact across the world, but predominantly in India, is the agriculture sector. And we all know that the way policies have been designed in the agriculture sector have incentivized the growing of extremely water-intensive crops, even in the water-short regions of India. So we have this extraordinary feature of the Indian subcontinental landscape that rice, wheat, and sugarcane, just 3 water-intensive crops, take away 80% of India's irrigation water. And if that continues to happen in states like Maharashtra, Punjab, Haryana, areas which are short in water, then we are only aggravating the groundwater crisis, because groundwater is the single most important source of irrigation water. 2/3 of India's irrigation is coming now from groundwater. So unless the entire landscape of policy governing agriculture changes, we have no chance of actually managing groundwater in a sustainable and equitable manner. And there are many elements of this agrarian policy. The most important one, in my view, is the public procurement policy of the government of India, which has centrally focused only on rice and wheat as the 2 primary overwhelming crops which are being procured by the government of India in the public procurement system in order to create the buffer stocks of grain which we have built up over many years. And yes, this policy has served well in building these buffer stocks. But what it has done also is that it has pushed farmers. We sometimes blame farmers for the situation of groundwater in India without realizing that farmers are operating in a policy environment which literally drives them to grow the crops that they are growing. And if this continues, then, as I said, the aquifers will keep depleting, the groundwater levels will fall, the groundwater quality will also continue to fall. So what we need to do is to diversify the portfolio of public procurement in India to include crops which are in alignment with the agroecology of different regions across the country. If we do that, then we have a chance of actually protecting the groundwater resource. And this is not merely about protection. See, sometimes all of us, people who are concerned about groundwater, take on a very ecologically fundamentalist view. And I would caution Margaret that sometimes in a presentation, I was getting an inclination of that. I'm sure that is not our intention, but we have to be very careful, because actually the best argument we can make for the change in agrarian policy is that currently it's not only that groundwater levels are falling, but the farmers who have access to groundwater irrigation are in fact the more privileged farmers and regions of the country, while the water scarce regions and the small and marginal farmers are being deprived. So it's an equity issue. It's an issue of making available the precious groundwater for millions of small and marginal farmers in India. And even more important in terms of the framework of users is the question of drinking water, because domestic water and drinking water now primarily also come from groundwater. 80 to 90% of our domestic water needs are being met by groundwater. And we are seeing that the same aquifer, which is used for extracting groundwater to provide the drinking water supply systems in different villages, the same aquifer is also being used to irrigate the water-intensive crops that I was referring to. So this hydroschizophrenia, which I describe in our management and governance of groundwater, actually is depriving the drinking water sources of sustainability and equity. And so again, unless we change the way we develop our drinking water schemes, unless we try and see that we need to holistically look at groundwater as a unified resource, we will again continue to deplete the aquifers across the length and breadth of India. And we must recognize that diversity, the diversity that characterizes aquifers, that we are using the same technology which may be okay, was okay till a certain point of time for alluvial aquifers, which have high rates of groundwater recharge. We are using the same technology of deep drilling of tube wells to actually, draw out groundwater in the hard rock regions of India, and hard rock regions now are almost 2/3 of the Indian subcontinent. So if we continue to do that and don't recognize the diversity as one of the integral features, which Margaret also was pointing to, of groundwater, we will continue to deplete groundwater. We have made some studies which show that groundwater, which took thousands of years to accumulate below the ground in the hard rock aquifers of India, has been depleted in the last 30 years in this endless extraction, this competitive, individualistic extraction of what is essentially a common pool resource. We have not recognized that although it's a renewable resource, it is finite, it is integrally a shared resource, and we need, therefore, to develop protocols for the collective sharing, collective governance and management of groundwater. But in order to enable these efforts at collective management and governance, we need to change the policies which are driving the individualistic competitive extraction of groundwater. I don't know how much more time I have, but the third framework of support structures actually includes a number of areas. It includes research and teaching on groundwater, where Margaret referred to the multiple ways of knowing. Michel Foucault once referred to the insurrection of subjugated knowledges. I think that is what we require. We have to subvert the dominant forms of knowing about groundwater. If groundwater continues to be dominated only by hydrogeologists and only by engineers, and does not get informed by multiple ways of knowing, which come from local communities, which come from the understanding of social mobilization, which is required in order to be able to actually manage and govern this resource properly. So unless we transform the way in which research and teaching is happening on groundwater, our students will continue to bring to the ground the same engineering hydrogeological mindset, uninformed by the social structures within which groundwater is embedded. The gender dimensions, which Margaret didn't talk about today, but which of our work I'm such a great fan. We need to bring in the structures of power, and that needs a multidisciplinary way of understanding and studying groundwater. The other element of the support structures is the data, which Paul's presentation brought out wonderfully. Yes.
Sorry, quick time check, please.
So how many minutes are you giving?
Maybe another minute, please.
Oh, okay, I'll conclude. So data again, unless, Margaret was questioning the data preoccupation, but, I actually believe that the generation of data in a participatory manner, where the primary stakeholders of groundwater actually become involved in the generation of meaningful data, is an extremely important exercise. And I keep urging my civil society partners that we must actually move in that direction. If the left to the government, the data that is generated is such poor quality and is at the scale which does not permit the proper use of data by the primary stakeholders of groundwater. I also wanted to mention the legal framework that we are governed by British common law, which is set in the 19th century, which actually incentivizes people and allows people to extract unlimited amounts of groundwater from below the ground, because that is what the law still says. In 21st century India, we have not moved beyond that. Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni and I have been on various government committees to try and formulate a different framework. We have come up with what we call a National Water Framework Law. People like KJ Joy have helped us formulate this, and that provides an alternative legal framework which builds upon the public trust doctrine enunciated by the Supreme Court of India. I think we need supportive legal instruments, because otherwise all the work that organizations like Aquadam and so many others are doing across the country does not have the kind of support structures we need. So to conclude, what I was trying to say is that policy must be informed by an understanding of the essential features of groundwater and the three frameworks that I outlined. Unless we build the supportive policies for all of those, whether it's the biophysical framework of groundwater, whether it's the framework of users, or the framework of support structures of research, teaching, data generation, law, and energy, which I didn't have time to speak about, but and I'm sure you can add to that list. till we reform all of those, we will not be able to arrive at a new paradigm for the management and governance of water in India or anywhere else on the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. So we'll quickly get into the question and answers. So there are basically a few questions, largely to Paul on recharge. I'm going to combine two questions. These questions are for Paul, but I think they are also important from the other perspectives that have been presented by Dr. Shah and Margaret, and if required, both of them can also pitch in. So the first, I'm going to combine two questions here, and the question is, why is there depletion in the first place? I mean, and whether supply side efforts such as managed aquifer recharge are enough to address the drivers of depletion. And as an extension to that, is there a need to study the aquifer characteristics before implementing managed aquifer recharge? Paul, do you want to take those questions? And then if the other speakers also have comments on this, they could also answer the questions. First, I would request Paul.
Yes, thanks, Siddharth. I did see that question posted in the Q&A section, but the presentations were so interesting, I wasn't able to multitask and try to type out an answer. It's good we have this opportunity. Basically, these humid flood-prone areas on alluvial hydrogeological terrain have historically not been areas where major water depletion problems have been evident. These have only emerged in the last 10 or 20 years as a result of the intensification of the use of groundwater for agriculture with increased cropping intensities. We're starting to see large parts now of the Gangetic Plain show signs of groundwater depletion, which was previously not the case. And that's why we decided to try to develop MAR approaches that are applicable to this type of setting, because the approaches that have been developed for drought-prone hard rock India aren't transferable to these humid alluvial settings. So that's basically the context there. Was there more to the question than that, Siddharth?
Yeah, so basically two parts. One is, can managed aquifer recharge, is it the only thing that can take care of depletion, and why did depletion occur in the first place? That's the first part. And the second part is on the importance of aquifer properties in designing a managed aquifer recharge scheme.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the memory test. It's now after midnight, and my faculties are not as good as they normally are. Yes, of course, we do need a very good baseline information and very strong hydrogeological assessments to ensure that we really have the type of problem that we foresee, that we really understand the context, both technically, socially, institutionally as well, so that we actually tailor our solutions to the particular context. So you do need to do very detailed investigations if those investigations aren't in place, and establish good baseline information and ensure the design for these interventions are appropriate to the context. Do we see MAR as the panacea and as the silver bullet for groundwater depletion in these areas? No, it's basically part of the toolkit, really. It's one technique that we have in our toolkit, but we really need to look at the other side of the coin as well in terms of finding ways that can reduce demand, but not jeopardize local community livelihoods, and ensure that we really are making sure that groundwater is an inclusive and equitable resource, as was pointed out by the other speakers. Groundwater, although it's ubiquitous, it's not particularly democratic, because it can be the power dimensions are at play, and those with the most resources are able to access the resource, sometimes at the detriment of poorer, less fortunate users, and we need to try to level out the playing field. So I hope that's covered the points of those excellent questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paul. I think they covered it. I'm sorry, I understand it's really late, but there's one more question for you. If you could just probably, it's a bit technical, from Peter Ravenscroft on, finding the arsenic levels similar in surface water and near groundwater. So his question is whether the samples were, filtered before being acidified, and he's also asking whether water quality and water levels, how can you monitor and manage them in rural Uttar Pradesh? So, yeah, I mean, quick response to that.
Yes, thanks, Peter, for that excellent question. We've spent a lot of our time talking about the water quantity dilemma, but equal to that is this water quality dilemma that's a serious menaces water quantity. And that was highlighted in some of the data I presented to show that there really is a water quality issue in this area that we've piloted, that goes way beyond the scope of the particular intervention that we were testing. It's a catchment-wide or river basin-wide phenomenon, and it's to do, in our case, with the upstream industrial activities that we've got a handle on mapping their typologies and their extent. It's really enormous. So basically, we are seeing water quality pollution throughout the river basin and in the shallow groundwater. It's been characterized by ourselves, and a good number of other studies have been conducted to reaffirm that. And in terms of arsenic itself, it is high in the surface water because there's upstream heavy metal pollution. And what we didn't filter the samples. We did and we didn't. We basically established the total arsenic or metal load entering our groundwater on unfiltered samples. And we also filtered as well to establish what it would be under a scenario of filtration. So we wanted to know the total loads and also what was in solution. So basically, water quality is problematic, and we recognize that we have a water quality problem both in the surface water and in the shallow water, groundwater, but not in the deeper water deeper groundwater that's disconnected from the surface water system. So we need to ensure that deeper groundwater is preserved, and the recharge practices like we're doing here are reserved for upper layers which are already compromised. So I hope I've done justice to that question. And as I said, we've got detailed technical documents which are available to read if you'd like to know much more. Thank you.
The next question is for Dr. Shah. This is again from Peter Ravenscroft. So in India, surface water and groundwater are managed separately, and as is their quality and quantity. Could or should India organize the participatory management of groundwater according to groundwater bodies, drawing on the European Water Framework Directive, wherein water bodies are assigned separate qualitative and quantitative status, which must both be good to give a good overall status? Dr. Shah?
Yeah, sure. It's a very important question, and as many of you know, this is one of the key reforms that I've been trying to push at least for the last 10 years within the government of India and with many state governments, because it's very true that one could even go as far as to say that the central reason why India has such a serious water problem today is precisely because we have not worked on groundwater and surface water, or on drinking water and irrigation, or on wastewater and water in an integrated manner. I call it the three kinds of hydroschizophrenia that characterize water management and governance in India. And without doing that, we will continue to actually, in fact, what we are doing is to create the problem of water rather than solve it. What was initially seen as a solution to the problem, that is the deep drilling for groundwater, has now become part of the problem itself. So this is kind of a vicious infinite regress into which the country has gone. And the only way of coming out of it is to have a more integrated solution. This is why we have proposed that India should actually disband the Central Water Commission and the Central Groundwater Board, which separately manage surface water and groundwater, never talk to each other. They do not even come together to plan any work in any river basin. So what we are saying is, let there be a National Water Commission. The National Water Commission will bring together the experts who are part of the Central Water Commission and the Central Groundwater Board, but will also have a multidisciplinary team of professionals from all the disciplines that are required for the effective management and governance of water in India, not just groundwater. And they will then make it a much more participatory approach, so that we have stakeholders from outside government who are part of the National Water Commission on a permanent basis. What I mean is, today, we do have governments, utilizing services of academic institutions, of institutions like Aquadam. These are routinely brought into either as members of committees or policy formulators. But then, depending on the whims and fancies, as I say, of passing bureaucrats and politicians, these people are brought in and discarded as and when they wish. The fact is, unless we make groundwater management and governance and water management and governance a people's movement, where the primary stakeholders of water are actually part of decision making at every stage, we are not going to be able to solve India's water problem. Now, I'm not therefore saying whether it's an aquifer which should be unit. I think a river basin with the associated aquifers would provide the best single unit of trying to get a handle on water resources in India. And therefore, instead of this centralized system where the Central Water Commission is sitting in Delhi, we actually should have people at each river basin. And that's what we proposed to the Government of India in our 2016 report on the 21st century architecture for water governance in India. And within those river basin, we should have experts, the state governments, primary stakeholders from that particular river basin, all coming together in a bottom-up approach. You cannot, the river basin authorities of India have been a failure. We need to build from the watershed and aquifer level upwards, following the principle of subsidiarity. So it's a lot of things. It's not just surface water and groundwater coming together. It's transdisciplinarity. It's the involvement of primary stakeholders and so on and so forth, which would finally all put together constitute the kind of paradigm shift that we are hoping to see.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. There are two more questions. I think both of them are for you, but I'll combine them. One is very specific about industrial belts, SEZs, and peri-urban areas, which affect the quantity and quality of groundwater, and how this affects the erstwhile subsistence farmers. So how should this be addressed in policies? And then, as an extension, do we need micro-level groundwater policies for different agroclimatic zones, virtual water trades, procurement policies, etc. at the micro water level? And if yes, then is it the right time to decentralize the subject of water at an agroclimatic zone?
Okay, so, industry is such an important thing actually, because Siddharth was sitting on my back, and understandably so. I dropped, in the framework of users, my third set of users was actually industry itself. And the fact is, as very rightly pointed out in the question, we have located so many water intensive industries in locations which are completely inappropriate from the point of view of sustainable water management and governance. And definitely that has endangered the access to basic water, the water for, life for so many people living in those regions. And unless, therefore, as I was, saying that, what does he know of groundwater who only groundwater knows? We have to look into the policy, industrial policy regarding giving, licenses for water intensive industries to be located in areas which face huge water scarcity, and also coastal areas. There are many other considerations which we have to very carefully factor in before deciding the location of our industries. Because, we just haven't factored in the ecological factors in any of our other economic policies. We act as if the economy exists quite independently of the ecosystem. But exactly as Margaret was trying to say, the economy is just a small subset of the larger ecosystem. COVID-19 has alerted us to the dangers of acting as if nature doesn't exist. And the way we have transgressed the boundaries of nature, we are paying a very heavy price for it. So industry is a very important example of what was being said, that we need to address the framework of the users of groundwater, without which we can never have success in the micro level experiments on groundwater management. And yes, the principle of subsidiarity. There is a great clamor all the time in India, because water is a state subject. People feel that the problem is that we have made it a state subject and states are doing whatever they want. We should have a strong center. This centralizing tendency is a recurrent tendency in Indian policy making in multiple dimensions of life. And again, in water, a lot of people try and advocate that. I am firmly convinced that we need to move in exactly the opposite direction, in the direction precisely suggested by the questioner, that we need to actually decentralize. And learning from my friend Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni and the extraordinary work of Aquadam, in the national water policy, which we have presented to the government of India very recently, we have actually said we have divided India into various hydrogeological settings, depending on the aquifer types found in different parts of India. And we have proposed aquifer typology specific policies, which must be adopted. So we must move towards these typological exercises. We cannot have a uniform policy across the country, because India is not a uniform monolith. The fundamental feature of our nation, the economy and society of India, is diversity. Whether it's culture, whether it's social, whether it's hydrogeology, whether it's agroecology, everything. And that's the power, actually. That's not something to be lamented. We must celebrate the diversity that we have in our country, and we must make policies that respect that diversity. And we have not done that. We have worked in the framework of centralized planning. Despite the abolition of the Planning Commission, nothing has changed on the ground. We continue to, in fact, centralize more and more, and we need to move in the direction of more and more decentralized policies based on river basin characteristics, based on aquifer characteristics, and so on, empowering local communities to actually be given the stewardship of the water that rightfully belongs to them.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. So I think we can take maybe one more question. Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni would like to ask that question. In the interest of time, we'll just take one more. There are some more questions in the Q&A, so if the speakers could take a look at that. Dr. Kulkarni?
Yes, thanks, Siddharth. And thanks for all the speakers. Thanks to all the speakers. I think it was so insightful. I mean, I have a specific question for Margaret, and I want her to maybe expand on what she was limited to saying in the short time frame that we gave her. So 2 points, Margaret. I mean, my first point, and I couldn't put this in the chat box for some reason. My first point was, I mean, can we look at history in a very contextual way, maybe? Can we look at the subject of history and begin to look at using history, as one of the disciplines to influence how people think and to understand how people think? So one is the whole context of history. And I think you covered it a bit, but I think I sort of lost myself in the words in the presentation. The second is again a question to you. Would it be, so the other message I gather from your presentation was using sciences differently from what we've done till now. So it's the same science, the same concepts, and can they be used differently in the approaches to a newfound paradigm of groundwater management and governance? I mean, we see evidence of this happening, but how do we take it to a much larger scale? So perhaps, Margaret, if you could.
Thanks, Himanshu, and sorry for being wordy and having a presentation that got you lost in my words. That was not my intention. History, yes, I think that's a very good suggestion, actually, and I think it's part of my proposal to what I call provincialize or situate or localize that knowledge. It includes a proposal to historicize knowledge, and that means becoming very reflectively aware of where knowledges come from and which experiences and whose experiences serve as the basis of generalizations. Because if you become more reflexively aware of that, I think it will bring with it more modesty, but also it will bring in a very, bring in a very useful way, it can bring greater awareness on the politics and norms that get hidden in knowledge. So yes, I really like the proposal of historization, or using history to understand knowledge and to bring it in. And your second question about a different way of doing science. To be honest, I think Himanshu and many of the other thinkers, activists on groundwater that you and your colleagues have gathered in this webinar series, for me are examples of doing science differently, of being grounded scientists who not just are modeling or thinking about nice new theories, but who also go to the field, talk to people, are grounded in the problem situations that they are trying to help solve. So I think you yourself, you are an excellent example of that. And I don't know how to upscale it, as you were, but I think doing more or trying through the networks that you already have, and through webinar series like this, it is already happening, I think.
Yeah, Himanshu, if you don't mind, I want to jump in and say that it's Margaret's work itself which is the most powerful example of the relevance of history, in understanding how we need to go ahead governing water across the world. The work that she's done on masculinities in water actually helps us understand the historical context in which the command and control approach to water emerged historically. And all students on water must actually read that book and also understand the perspective that is provided by Margaret in her work. Because without that, I think we just do not understand where this is all coming from. And I think it's very important to understand that, because if we want to build a different future, if we don't understand the context from which it is coming, I think we will again make the same mistakes. So sorry I butted in, but I couldn't resist. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret and Dr. Shah again. Now, I understand we're really running late, so I will not take any more questions for the moment. I would request the speakers to please just take a look at the Q&A box and answer the questions that are addressed to you. We'll move on, and so we'll take a presentation now by our one last speaker, Dr. Basant Maheshwari, Professor Maheshwari. He has a rich experience of working in the water sector for over 25 years. Unfortunately, given the time zone difference, Dr. Maheshwari could not join us himself, but he shared a recording. So we'll quickly play the recording right now. After this recording, we'll take a quick 2-minute break and then begin with the panel discussions.
Hello, this is Basant Maheshwari from Western Sydney University. I would like to talk about MAVI project, which is the role of citizen science in achieving India's future water security. So if we look at the water situation, irrigated agriculture consumes about 20% of the total cultivated land worldwide, and it contributes 40% of the food produced. And what is happening is land use changes are happening due to urbanization, and this has affected the vegetation, groundwater recharge, and river flows. The whole hydrologic cycle is disturbed now. And what we used to do, hydrologic modeling, is now under question whether we can predict the future based on historical data. And groundwater is going to be very critical and important in terms of producing food and supplying drinking water and many other uses. So coming to India, about 60% of irrigated agriculture and 80% drinking water in rural areas, and more than 50% of drinking water in urban areas, and 50% or more of industry water comes from groundwater. And the Green Revolution of 1970s, which helped to secure food, but it affected water security. And pumps and drilling technology really changed the groundwater sustainability, although they helped, but also they affected groundwater's futures. And people are migrating from rural areas to urban areas because the groundwater is becoming scarce, monsoon is not very reliable, and so there are no sort of livelihood opportunities in villages. So what options do we have for achieving water security? Water literacy at all levels. So we really need to strengthen water literacy and to understand the importance of water and how we can manage and how we can conserve and recycle, engage people and develop water science for people. So we really need the science that people can understand and apply. And use of water where it falls and try to live with what we have. That's very important. And really, that will be the future. And the idea of catch the rain where it falls and when it falls, but leave some for the environment. So we really need to manage what we get and how we use it. So coming to what options do we have for achieving water security and food security? Wastewater reuse is an option. Groundwater recharge and its use through cooperative management is another option. The time has also come to give the ownership of water management to people. Governments can help facilitate, but really cannot do this effectively on its own. And we also need translational research. So what we research, what we find, can we translate into something useful, something community, farmers, or other people can use? And there is a role of Internet of Things, smartphone apps, and so on to manage water better. So why do we have the groundwater problem? One is the greed. Everybody wants it, but no one cares for it. And that has really created a problem. Limited knowledge, how groundwater flows, how much groundwater we have, how we can withdraw. All these are questions, and they really affect how we use groundwater. Lack of understanding what we are doing. This is also a problem. So there is a limited understanding of where groundwater is flowing, how much groundwater we have, and all those things. So it is a people-related problem. And what this means is we need people-friendly technical, social, and policy solutions. We need to involve people. And for this, we need citizen science approach. Solution to groundwater problems. Some people suggest to control the groundwater use by enacting some law and criminalize if someone breaks the law. Some people have come up with technical solutions, such as have a pump that operates when you insert a smart card and allow you to pump out the allocated amount and stops when you have reached your limit. So it works fine in principle, but are these solutions workable in reality, and are they going to be sustainable? What kind of technology and technical solution will work? This is something we need to really think and also consider the ground situation. So what is citizen science? Citizen science is participation and collaboration of ordinary people in scientific research. And all age groups and education levels, people can be involved. And that's what I'm going to talk about in Marvi, and used in all sorts of topics, area, water, medicine, environment, socioeconomic studies, etc. So why citizen science? Engages and values community and gives the ownership of the problem and the ownership of the solution to ordinary people. It is also cost effective, and with the smartphones available nowadays, they can be used to the best advantage, and it can produce reliable data for understanding what is happening and what can be done, and engages people. And it can be lead to grassroots level action and cooperation, because if people collect data and they understand what is happening, then you get full support of them. So coming to the Marvi project, so Marvi stands for Managing Aquifer Recharge and Sustaining Groundwater Use Through Village Level Intervention. So the word village is very important, and it's managing and sustaining. And so this project started in 2012, and it is still running. And basically, it involves three aspects: participatory data collection, sharing information and building understanding, and engaging with policymakers, government agencies, groundwater users, and other stakeholders. So we had 9 organizations involved, 30 researchers, and 35 farmer researchers. We call them Bujal Jankar or BJs. So Bujal Jankar means, Bujal means groundwater, and Jankar means informed. So the Marvi approach. So generally, there are researchers dealing with science of the groundwater. There is government dealing with policy, regulation, governance, all those things, and the community in between, which tries to do some things, but really not connected with science so much. And also government also, the connection is not very strong. So what this Marvi project tried to do is bring these three together and really connect them to have action on the ground. So who were the actors in Marvi? So the researchers, like some of us, and the Bujal Jankars or BJs, they are the volunteers, and the schools and communities, village communities. We also involve Gram Panchayat, that is village councils, state and central government agencies. How do we use citizen science in the Marvi project? So we train these BJs and work with them on ongoing basis. Collected groundwater depth, rainfall data, water quality, checked them water level and socioeconomic data. Worked with local schools and community groups. Worked with Gram Panchayat and state government agencies, developed tools and resources for data collection, analysis, and capacity building, and connected with policymakers at state and central government level at different times of the project. So basically, involving the villagers to become citizen scientists, to work on collecting data, to create their own interpretation and use that interpretation, meaning, or learning in their way of managing groundwater. So the citizen scientists, the Bhujal Rankar, so we engaged local volunteers, 25 of them in Rajasthan, 10 in Gujarat. We provided basic hydrogeologic concepts, mapping, water table, water quality measurements, and other things. And that took up to 8 to 9 months or a year. And eventually they become local champions. And they were really good interface between the research team and community. And they really felt empowered and valued, because these are the people who had primary education, school education, or middle school, and left school a long time ago. But what this Marvi project tried to do is really train them and really build their confidence, because they have life skills, but what they needed was the confidence building, capacity building to understand and make sense of what they're experiencing in terms of groundwater management. So one of the things we realized during the project within a couple of years, that we are collecting so many data, because these BJs were collecting data every week. So every week we were monitoring 250 wells in Rajasthan, 110 in Gujarat, and so the data grew very quickly. So we developed this app called My Well. So it can take data about the well water levels, the depth of groundwater, the rainfall, water quality, and water level in check dams. And then they are fed into the app, and anyone can visualize, see what is happening to water levels, the rainfall, and so on. So this is a picture of Louis Daly and BJs and other people from the project working with the app and trying to see how it works. So what we learned from this exercise or this project is we need to help people to work together for sustainable groundwater futures. So for managing and sustaining groundwater, we need information on 4 aspects: groundwater levels, rainfall, water quality, check dam water levels. So if we have the above information for a given village or watershed, we can understand what is happening in terms of groundwater use and recharge. It is important to remember that we are solving the problem that was created by people, and any good solution needs to involve them. Any use of technology should work with people, not remove them from the scene and alienate them. Because when people work with the problem, they monitor something, they measure something, they internalize, and that changes their thinking, their attitude, and they get into action. Also, technology can be used for training and capacity building. So, for example, e-learning through short videos, online platform for specific self-paced learning, all those things can be possible even with the farmers. So what are the take-home messages? Complex problem like groundwater management often requires simple solution. And so this is very much true for groundwater management. The citizen science approach developed in Marvi can empower local community and can help develop their own groundwater management dialogue and strategies. Communication about what is happening what can be done and how it can be done is the key with a common pool resource and invisible resource like groundwater. So we need to develop and simplify groundwater science that can be used by farmers and other community members and can be implemented by government agencies. The BGs can collect highly reliable information for groundwater levels, rainfall, and recharge estimation with simple technology, and also very cost-effective. BG collected data can be used for communicating village-scale groundwater balance analysis and modeling. This is what we have done, and even we use the BG's data to publish in international journals. Villages can find their own solutions if they are supported and nurtured. We have a number of publications and available for download from the Marvi website. Thank you very much.
Yes. So I would like to thank Dr. Maheshwari for sending this recording, sharing it with us. Now, let's again, because we're running late, let us not take a break and just continue to the panel discussions. Now, we have 4 panelists, and I would request that even for the panelists, we have kept 10 minutes each, but I would request that we split these 10 minutes into 2 parts. The first part where the panelists can respond to today's presentations, if they have any observations, additions, comments. And in the second round of where they'll be given another 5 minutes, they can then add their insights on groundwater governance, a framework for groundwater governance. So I will go round each panelist for the first 5 minutes, where I will request you all to please respond to today's presentations. So our first panelist for today is Dr. Audrey, who is a senior consultant, and her work focuses on institutions and public policies such as groundwater recharge, participatory management, etc. Dr. Audrey.
Thank you, Siddharth. So 5 minutes, indeed, I plan to discuss at the same time and maybe give some insight. So tell me after 5 minutes, let's see. So thanks a lot to Aquadam for inviting me. It's really the 3 first seminars, and today it's fascinating and very interesting. But I go directly. So thank you, Paul Pavlich, for his very interesting sharing his experience about managed aquifer recharge, and not only the implementation but also assessment. And I was very interested in is that you focus not only on technical aspects but also social challenge. Regarding assessment, you talked about cost-benefit analysis and community perception, and above all, regarding implementation, about stakeholder engagement. And this is very interesting because from my the experience we could have, what we could observe is that in other places, MAR is implemented often assessed only from the biophysical point of view, and also it's implemented like it's like a new tool for hydraulic mission. And so really it's important to consider MAR, as you said, not as a panacea, but as really a tool among other tools, and also to implement MAR with this change of paradigm that also Margaret described and give us insight. It was really perfect, Margaret, not wordish, I may say, but it's because it's a challenge, this shift of paradigm and what you presented. And I follow you, of course, in this shift. And the 3 points, the 3 foot you raised at the end. I mean, provincializing, worldling, and multiplying, and according attention to diversity. It's very important. You insisted on the importance of the situation, on the pragmatist approach, on the feminist approach. If I may point one aspect, only some aspect of your talk, of course, it was already said, the importance of history, the importance of the building of some domination, but also the shift and what you propose, what is really challenging, because it's really to consider uncertainty and to cope with uncertainty and to cope with uncertainty in science. So that's why when Himanshu asked you about the shift also in science approach, I fully agree what was presented by Himanshu, but also by Basant Maheshwari is another way to do science. It's really to accept uncertainty and to implement science. Also, I may insist I may focus on one point in your talk when the shift from Homo economicus to when you say that humans are caring, affective, and relational beings. It's really a strong shift of paradigm, considering the human being, and not only farmers, not only people, not only women, but also policymakers, considering everybody as you that are caring, affective, and relational beings. So this is the challenge of conviviality, codependence. So thanks again for raising this really and enlightening this possible change of paradigm, and that is already implemented in some places. Then I go to the last, I don't know if I have enough time, but I hope, to Mihir Shah talk. Thanks a lot for raising many challenges for Indian national policies, and of course, not only for India, but many countries. If I may stop on one word, for example, in your talk, it was hydroschizophrenia. For me, it's very interesting to always consider that we are all indeed to some extent hydroschizophrene regarding water and groundwater. And this is connected to the diversity and what the talk, of course, of Margaret, focusing on pluriversal and diversity. So thanks for this work, hydroschizophrenia, and considering multiplicity also of norms. I mean, for groundwater, we cannot simply oppose preservation and mining. It's always more complicated, and there are very different perspectives that may be considered. Also in your talk, you talk about data, and it was very important, but maybe I stop here. That I may have reached my 5 minutes, and I will keep the rest for the second part. Thank you.
So next, I'll invite Mr. S. Vishwanath, who has a very rich experience of working in the water sector, in water and wastewater for the last 34 years. He's a trustee and advisor at the Biome Environment Trust.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for that. So very enriching talks. Two of them were project-oriented. Marguerite's was more socio-feminist, ecological-oriented, and Mihir, of course, brings the policy perspective and the new learning. So very, very interesting. So I'll just specifically respond to the four speakers. We have been through the era of great romance. So, for example, the 50s and 60s was the romance of the dams and canals. The 60s and 70s was the Green Revolution. The 80s and perhaps the 90s and the 2000s was rainwater harvesting with dying wisdom there. And now the great romance is groundwater. That's with science, with technology, with policy, and with everybody. And these are great tilting at windmills. That's the broad picture that you can, because dams and canals were seen as panaceas, the Green Revolution was seen as a panacea, rainwater harvesting was seen as a panacea, and now groundwater, it's the time for groundwater. So, and we see the various facets of groundwater in motion right now through the excellent seminars that you've organized, the weekly ones, and the kind of thoughts that have come through. A couple of quick responses. One of them is that the well diggers and the borewell drillers have not been part of the solution space, right? So this is curious and fascinating for me. And this comes from the Margaret terminology of projects of empire and conventional knowledge hegemony. We have, according to Dr. Mihir Shah, 43 million wells and bore wells, and these have been dug by the borewell drillers, essentially coming from Tiruchengood. And it would be fascinating to hear their side of the story and how they can be involved with the problematization of the solutionary that we attempt, right? And in all the 4 weeks, we missed them. So perhaps fascinating to see what their point of view would be. The second sort of comment which would come is more from the common pool resource approach. One of the best institutions we have for groundwater is the GSTA, the Groundwater Survey and Development Agency in Maharashtra. And their sort of set of bylaws and model laws, which they even got passed in the assembly, looked at groundwater as CPR, as common pool resource, and set forward a set of principles on how to manage it. And then it has had a politically very difficult passage. It's not yet been drafted as rules and regulations on the ground. So our tilting at the windmill with groundwater as CPR, as common pool resource, with citizen science, with managed aquifer recharge, is, in my opinion, in an existential sense, bound to fail. But so therefore, what do we learn and what are the suboptimal solutions that will work will be fascinating to watch as we go ahead. The other one point that was of significance to me, not just for the 4 speakers today, but also in the previous talks, was the missing nature of the informal, right? The farmers who use wastewater, for example, or the way they use groundwater, the way they deal with soils. They're seen as stakeholders. They're not seen as solution providers. Their knowledge is not seen as relevant to the policy drives that we have. How do we address that would be a challenge to come along. And the last point that I want to make before I hand over to the next person is the missing gap is urban groundwater. Right? So there's a little bit of mention of it. Urban groundwater is critical. And how do you drive urban groundwater through the common pool resource lens when the density of drilling of bore wells or the exploitation of groundwater or the aquifers or the sub-aquifers moving from communities to communities, which would then make it very, very interesting to see how solutions would work out, would perhaps drive us further in the future. So these are my initial points and thoughts on the 4 speakers today, as well as the speakers of the week. Before, thanks, Siddharth.
Thank you for actually such a crisp response. Next, I'll invite Professor Philippe, who is a professor on international and environmental law at the School of Oriental and Asian Sciences at University of London. And his work basically focuses on environmental law and natural resources.
Okay, thank you very much. Since we had been told not to prepare presentations, I prepared something to say related to what was being said over the past 2 hours. So now I'm not ready to divide the 2 things, so I'll speak only once and I'll try to mix the 2 things that Siddharth wanted us to do. So in a sense, I tried to link the different things that have been said from the point of view of the different dimensions of governance in terms of the paradigm shift, which is the perspective for the session. So I guess whether it's the water security perspective that was given, whether it's the legal dimension, the historical dimension that were mentioned, because of what I work on, I'll just take on a little bit more on the legal perspective to try and link some of the elements that have been brought together. So in terms of the issues I see arising related to what has been said, the first thing is the problem we have with the universal framework. So that's very much what Margaret was telling us about. Now, I link that with the issue of land rights and the problem that we have with the fact that land rights have been the handle to access groundwater, regardless, for instance, of the inequality in access to land or landlessness. So that's the first element I'd highlight. Second thing is the problem we have with land rights. Land rights are really at the center of what we need to look at in that sense, is that they link to framing rights to groundwater as individual rights. And that goes against what virtually everyone said tonight, in terms of groundwater having to be looked at as a common pool or different names that we may want, common pool resource or different names that we may want to use. The third one is that the focus on land rights indirectly, not necessarily directly, but indirectly leads to a focus on use much more than protection, and definitely with no focus on aquifer level protection because it's atomized at the level of individual land owners. Lastly, in terms of the framework we have now, moving on from land, it's been very much a top-down framework that we've been dealing with in terms of governance, whether in terms of state legislation, whatever groundwater laws we have, or union regulation, whatever comes through the environmental law derived framework. And that goes clearly against, again, everything else that's been said in terms of bottom-up, localization of the regulation of groundwater. Now, what this really seems to tell us is that the existing framework for groundwater governance is both unsuited to the task and unsuitable. So as again mentioned earlier tonight, a universal framework is not what we want because we need to look at groundwater from a local perspective, which everybody here and everywhere agrees. But when it comes to it, governance is framed around very much a universal understanding. It may be universal only at the level of state in India, or in terms of the universal policy prescriptions we have at the global level, for instance, in terms of water scarcity, to explain the governance that we have today. The second element is that the link with land rights is one of the reasons why policy and groundwater law looks at groundwater as a natural resource rather than a common pool resource, a public trust, a common heritage. Again, those different notions that different disciplines bring to the debate, which want to speak about the same one and the same thing, which is that groundwater should not be looked at as something which is either owned or governed through individual rights or individual preferences. Thirdly, the top-down framework essentially deprives local communities, so not individuals, but local communities, from effective control over groundwater, water/groundwater. That's okay. That's what Siddharth highlighted at first, and which every speaker has highlighted in one way or another. And communities are really the missing link, in a sense, in terms of the governance and legal frameworks that we have today. Now, in terms of an alternative paradigm, I guess, okay, we've kind of had two reactions to changes in groundwater use over the past 50, 60 years. The first one was the reaction in terms of governance to the massive increase in groundwater use in the 60s and onwards, okay, Green Revolution, which led to the states trying to regulate groundwater use. That essentially is a 1970 model bill, entirely top-down framework, which is what we have reflected in most of the groundwater laws we have at present. Now, it took until 2010, essentially, when Dr. Shah started driving a process to rethink groundwater law for things to start changing a little bit. Okay, no, they've changed a lot in terms of thinking, but a little bit in terms of on the ground. The result has been the new, okay, it's not so new anymore, Model Bill 2011 and 17, which essentially integrates all the dimensions that have been mentioned today. So what this is making me think is that there is really a coherence in terms of what people coming at it from different disciplines, different perspectives, think about the need for groundwater governance. Now, the issues, okay, in terms of how to look forward, the problem is that the take-up has been very slow in terms of states or policymakers taking up this new framework. Interestingly, okay, I'll just finish with that in 30 seconds. Interestingly, there's a new groundwater law in UP adopted in 2019, which takes up some of the elements of that new framework, such as the idea of common pool and public trust, the idea of a groundwater security plan, which is an important dimension of foregrounding protection in groundwater management. It also starts with a bottom-up framework, but then things start being less progressive in the way in which the institutional structure is set up. For instance, the Panchayat Groundwater Subcommittee essentially only has officials and members nominated by the BDO, so it's not as top-down as it was before, but it's still top-down, and there is still a very strong state-level framework. So I guess what this tells us is that there is an understanding among policymakers as well that there must be change, that the old framework we have is not suitable anymore, but there is still a lot of ground to be covered to ensure that this is taken up in terms of all the ideas that have been presented tonight.
Thank you so much again for keeping within your time. I will now invite Mr. Eklavya Prasad, who leads an initiative and an organization known as Make Pine Abhiyan, which literally means Cloudwater Campaign for almost 2 decades now. Mr. Prasad.
Sorry, thank you, Siddharth. I'll be sharing the perspective today accumulated by working with Make Pine Abhiyan, also along with Aquadam and Biome, and with reference to the detailed thoughts iterated by Margaret and Dr. Shah on the often ignored perspectives of groundwater. Now, we have been working a lot in the eastern part of the country, Bihar, Jharkhand, and parts of West Bengal. So most of my sharing based on what was presented, and it will be overlaid with the thoughts that one has experienced or in Bihar, in the eastern part of the country. The concept and practices of governance and management, at the micro level basically is an extremely critical aspect while addressing groundwater related issues. However, the monopath approach towards solution dotted with technical components for a resource that has, which Himanshu ji just mentioned about the historical perspective. So I'm kind of looking at groundwater resource as a historical, social, cultural, personal, ecological, climatic, scientific, technological components. And the resource having these different components is actually being addressed through a very monopath approach, which says it all. And that this articulation was very well articulated by both Margaret and Dr. Shah in their presentation. Further on, the alternatives which we are talking today, whether we are talking about an alternative groundwater governance or groundwater management perspective, the alternatives hardly generate much support, and hence they are better ignored, or else the easier path thing is to actually follow the prescribed path without question. And therefore the entire thrust to scale rather than from scale is an indication of this misplaced priority. And if you look at groundwater, I mean, it is a diverse resource. It has, and there are diverse scenarios, whether in a panchayat or at a municipal corporation level. And all of that is being addressed through a very homogeneous approach. And that is something which needs to be democratized. The compilations have to be democratized. The thoughts have to be democratized. So the strategies, design, and action. And that is when we will be able to push in or look at the alternative groundwater governance and management framework. And why is it important? Because of the fact that capturing the dynamic, social, ecological, and hydrogeological variations of groundwater, it is the interpretation of these micro areas that is basically is important in our work. If we have to translate the whole approach vis-a-vis the kind of work that we are trying to do, or kind of difference that we are trying to make with regard to the groundwater resource. Unlocking of the interpretation of these diversities along with the community and stakeholders, and developing a localized thinking, and thereafter a strategy is a critical output, which is what we all need to be working towards. Unfortunately, the way things are, it is, as I said earlier in my talk, that we are kind of following a monopath kind of an approach, where things are either looked at from a district perspective or a state perspective or a national perspective. And whereas when you look at the details at the ward level, or for that matter at the hamlet level, they are extremely, they are not a mirror image. Now, if that is not happening, then how are we, what is the stake at which we are working in terms of investments, in terms of the future thoughts about addressing the problems? Let me give you an example here. The kind of, there has been a lot of talk about groundwater-based drinking water pipe supply in Bihar. Now, North Bihar, the areas that we are working, it's actually flood prone. We have and the entire region is embedded in typologies of floods, and there are recurring floods occurring there. Now, in that context, if you look at the kind of work which has happened, the kind of implementation with regard to the piped water supply, it is not very different from what has actually happened in South Bihar. So the components which needs to be considered for us to give that kind of a relevance to the resource is absolutely missing. And there is a lot of I would say importance given to a kind of a prescribed path that needs to be followed everywhere. So this is one of the aspects which I thought would be interesting to highlight, that in a location like in a region like East India, where there are and also very specific to North Bihar, these are the issues that needs to be taken up. Now,
sorry, time check.
Sure.
We'll come back to you in 5 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Now I'll just go back to the panelists for their specific thoughts on groundwater governance. So we'll go back to the same order. Audrey, begin with you.
Yeah, thank you. So, like Philippe, I divided my talk. So now maybe in my second part, I would like to extend the discussion and focus on 2 points. First point is data and knowledge, and second point is indeed groundwater professionals, skill and means also. So first point, it has been said several times since the beginning of the 4th webinar that there is a lack of knowledge. Of course, there is a lack of knowledge, but I may say also there are more and more knowledge regarding groundwater. And so a critical stance on the knowledge produced is necessary and interesting. As Mihir Shah said, data are important, are necessary. Data producing data could be emancipatory, for example, on gender, on caste issues, but also, for example, about on quality of groundwater. We talked about arsenic a few minutes ago. But it's an approach of data, looking at them as convention. Even measuring arsenic is not so easy, of course, because you measure in some place only, you measure at some times only. So there are convention, and all these data are important. But I would like to insist not only on data, but on more broadly on representation of groundwater. And following Margaret's proposal to consider plurality is also to consider plural representation of groundwater. Margaret shows drawing. In their project, they produce drawing and not only graphs and maps. And there is, regarding groundwater, there are many maps. maps are always produced, but also let's use arts and different type of representation to face this challenge of communication. Aquadam did these amazing movies we showed on the first webinar. So this is maybe my first point here, to consider plural representation of groundwater and even arts. I think now about a movie, for example, Well Done Abba, or other Indian movies that are focusing and representing groundwater. How do they represent groundwater regarding this issue of communication and managing together this resource? My second point is about groundwater professional. It also has been discussed several times. And I, of course, agree with the issue of interdisciplinarity. But when we talk about interdisciplinarity, we talk about science and scientists. And groundwater professionals, of course, are not only scientists, even if most of them have a scientific background. I don't know around the table, the screen, not the table today, but the screen. I mean, we are maybe all water professional, groundwater professional. So, of course, interdisciplinarity is important, but also skills of facilitation, communication, negotiation, compromising, hybridizing, if I take the term, if I use the term that Margaret used in her talk. So, I mean, all these skills are important in the training of groundwater professionals. And above all, we need staff and means to make groundwater visible, to take care of about groundwater. So I don't know, 5 minutes, I think it's almost okay. So I will stop there with that, maybe 2 points for the discussion.
You still have another 2.5 minutes if you want to add something.
Okay, so I may, I thought I was, yeah, I was very fast in my first part indeed, because I had to share in 2 parts the different point. No, maybe if I would like the speakers maybe to go on the point I focused in their talk. Maybe it would be interesting to follow the discussion. Okay, I think I went too fast on the point in the first part. So I will stop here and let space for discussion.
No issues. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'll invite the next panelist, Vishwanath, for your thoughts on groundwater governance and the approach towards governing it.
Yeah, thanks, Andre, for being fast and giving me 1.5 minutes. I hope Siddharth transfers that, but the jokes apart. There's this very interesting dialectics around data, right? So many of the technocrats are obsessed with the data. And it's fascinating, the data discourse itself for me. You know, the Niti Aayog, which is the think tank which replaced the Planning Commission, projected based on data, official data, that Bengaluru, the city that I live in, would run out of groundwater by 2020. That's last year. Yeah. So that's data. And that's data in the public domain. And then that's been printed by the topmost think tank of the country. And it's out there in public domain. So then what's the response of the state? The response of the state is to say that the city's water security is under threat, and it proposes 2 projects. One, which is 420 kilometers away from a major reservoir, and the second is on the river Kaveri itself, a project called Mekedatu, which will bring water and water security to the city. Right. So this data is being generated by a think tank, and it's published data, and therefore this is the story. The second set of data which I get from the city of Bangalore is from the traditional well digging community with whom we work. And they tell us that there are at least 10,000 open wells, dug wells, not bore wells, open wells, with water at about 10 to 12 feet in various parts of the city. Now, what sense do you make of it? One set of data tells us that the groundwater table is at 8 or 10 feet, and the other set says that it's all out of, it's all run out, and therefore you have to take up to. So the problem with the data is that big data can only be manipulated or processed by those who have the power to do that, the intellectual power or the financial power to hire that intellectual power to do the processing. So I'm very suspicious of the predatory state. I'm very suspicious of big data. And I don't know why we obsess with data in a certain form. And therefore, the politics of data is something that we need to be very worried about in terms of groundwater specifically, because it's a scarce resource and it's running out. And therefore, how we manage data would be crucial in terms of the governance itself, right? So what is the governance framework? What is the data framework? What is the privacy to data? How do we make sure that it's localized and it's based on community knowledge, and that the providers of data have the first charge on data is something that we need to worry about as we go along. The second very interesting thing that's happening here in the city of Bangalore is that treated wastewater from the city, about 1,100 million liters, is being transferred to the drought-prone districts which surround the city up to 100 kilometers and are filling lakes. These lakes then recharge the shallow aquifer, and from the shallow aquifer, farmers are allowed to pick up the water for agricultural use, right? Now, there's no law in India which tells us what can be done for recharge with treated wastewater. So this particular project went all the way up to the Supreme Court and was cleared by the Supreme Court. And then it is now being monitored by a committee, and the project is on, right? So about 1,100 million liters eventually of treated wastewater will fill lakes and fill shallow aquifers and will be used by farmers. Luckily, I think, that there is no law or there's no legal framework, because then we'll have to grapple with the situation. The traditionalist hydrogeologists will say, oh, the aquifers are getting contaminated. But is it possible for certain aquifers to be contaminated? Do we reserve certain aquifers for drinking water purpose, which should have the highest quality of water? These kind of negotiations are something that will be interesting. And they seem to best happen in the informal, not in the formalized state setup, where the state then sets up vast bureaucracies, as we saw with irrigation, perhaps hopefully not with groundwater, vast bureaucracies to manage it, which will be completely sort of rent-seeking bureaucracies. And now, God forbid that those rent-seeking bureaucracies come into place. And therefore, governance should not be about rent-seeking, should not be about imagined romanticized communities, should realize the realities on the ground and deal with it in a very localized fashion. And therefore, it's not even the state which should be the unit of governance. It should be something even more smaller, something like gram panchayats or village level management of groundwater. That is the architecture that I think would be the future. Yeah, thanks, Siddharth, for that.
You didn't even take your own time, so but okay, thank you for that.
Brevity is a lost art.
No, thanks a lot for that. Philip, would you like to add something to what you've already spoken?
No, that's fine, thanks.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Iklaveji?
Just a couple of things. First, I start from where Vishwanath left in terms of data. At present, we are actually, trying to figure out the water and sanitation scenario in Dhanbad Municipal Corporation area. And interestingly, the official data, it all projects that there is huge dependence on the pipe water supply. And we are getting water from Maithon, which is on Barakar River. And the survey that we are doing, it has come out with a projection which is totally contrary to the dominant thought which exists, or the dominant argument. And despite the pipe water supply, there is huge dependence on groundwater. So when we are trying to understand the water resources of Dhanbad Municipal Corporation area, the existence of groundwater and rainwater also is absolutely nil. Now, in this kind of a scenario, one understands as to why a particular strategy is being pushed. But on the other hand, we also are confronting a situation where people are talking about this resource actually depleting. So which brings us to this whole idea, or the whole problem in terms of what next, as to how do you address this issue? Because individually people are able to access the resource and their problems are being met. And there is no way that they can look at the problem in a collective manner. Therefore, there is a huge challenge, and I totally agree to what Vishwanath had mentioned earlier, that the presence or the talk about groundwater urban areas is something which is so critical. And I'm talking about a municipal corporation in Dhanbad, where we have a population of about 1.16 million. So this is one issue that actually needs to be brought in. And, there are we need to explore ways as to how the groundwater governance and how the groundwater management actually should get tested or tried in such locations where people are looking at things from an extremely individualistic perspective. Now, this brings us to another issue, and it's a very it's an interesting debate. It's between the groundwater governance and management, though the lines are extremely blurred, and it is an issue which evokes a lot of passion as well. Now, because of this, Make Pine Abhiyan, the way we approached this whole issue was that, we started off with this whole agreement that it's to each their own. And therefore, our beginning was always focused on to start off with information compilation. Now, this information compilation was not actually from the data which was already in the public domain. It was actually generating data from the grassroots, from people who were involved. And that is when the historical perspective came in. That is when the gender perspective kicked in. That is when we talked about the diversity of perceptions within a small unit. For instance, we were looking at the ward, not even the panchayat. And as I said earlier, the perceptions, the interpretation of groundwater at the ward level was not the mirror image of what happened, what the reality was or the projection was at the panchayat level. Forget about the block and the district and the state. So as far as the approach is concerned, I think so there has to be a way to deal with this problem at the micro level, because there are immense external factors that would not allow an alternative to thrive. As I had also mentioned earlier, that there is this entire thrust of just ensuring that a particular monopath gets adopted everywhere. And that's easy, to scale rather than from scale. So this is one element which I thought I would iterate, and I would also flag that when we are talking about groundwater governance and management, we need to be as micro as possible, and there will be a lot of resistance because that will upset this whole formula to scale. But then the whole effort needs to go on, because if we stop doing this, there would hardly be any alternatives that will be talked about. And in this slide, I see the piped water supply scheme that is being implemented has a very bleak future, because problems are going to get further complicated because the existing problems have not been addressed. So this is where I would stop, Siddharth. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again for keeping in time. Now, again, because we are so behind time, I will request Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, who leads Aquadam, to please summarize and give us concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. And I think I'm not going to take long. I'm not going to keep people from their dinners and going to bed, or from their lunches, wherever they are. But I think it has been, first and foremost, it has been an enthralling series of learning for me. I mean, I've taken profuse notes, this time even more profusely than ever before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split my summary in two parts, and it's not going to take more than 3 to 4 minutes. So let me begin with certain specifics, especially brought out by the panelists. So first and foremost, I think Audrey's points about, coping with uncertainty in science, shift from economics to human relationships. I think these are two very important points that we need to think about when we look at a changing environment around groundwater governance. I think she also brought about the idea of skill set of groundwater professionals and sort of bringing in a more transdisciplinary set of skills to people who directly work on groundwater. Vishwanath, next. Big points, well diggers, people's point of view, which is something important. I also believe that it highlights the question of stakeholders versus solution providers. I think we need to look at communities as solution providers. And like Vishwanath often says, that there is a whole domain of informal negotiations when we deal with groundwater on the ground, and people working on the ground on the subject of groundwater know this, very often leading to suboptimal solutions. And very often the suboptimal is oftentimes better than the business as usual that is going on in the field. And that therefore brings us to the next point, which is, I think sort of this whole question that Philip talked about. And I want to borrow from what I think Seema had said in her presentation. And I think Philippe articulated this in a slightly different language. So can we bring in a more caring and sharing approach to regulation? Because that's where command and control in formal regulation is the strongest. And how do we bring in a more human approach to regulation? Eklavya's points, all points well taken, but I think his most important point was about, diversity exists at different levels. And it's not just about hydrological diversity, it's also about social diversity. And right now, most mainstream solutions on the table are quite homogenized and unidirectional. So we cannot look at, which sort of reiterates the point I brought up earlier in my first articulation. We cannot look at groundwater management and groundwater governance separately. And we need a somewhat flexible approach to looking at that. A broad set of 3 or 4 comments. I also believe we need to define and describe certain terms. I mean, take the term communities, for example. And I believe when we refer to communities in a sort of fairly well-informed audience like this, it's usually in the context of water as a resource and a system alongside individual users. That's just an example of how we need to sort of get out of that. I'm sorry, Margaret, I didn't really mean what I said when I talked about wordishness, but I think what I wanted to highlight was you conveyed it in a very, very nice way that we need more time to understand some of these concepts. We need more time to take it to communities so that people can use these concepts on the ground, people who work on the ground, people who work with communities, and the users themselves to think a little more differently than what they're thinking today. So I think it's a phenomenal idea. And it also brought back to me thinking about the question that somebody asked Paul, that MAR, often managed aquifer recharge, is often construed as a supply side mechanism. But because we know, at Aquadam, my colleague Uma and I were part of the early thinking on managed aquifer recharge. Some of the earlier pilots we were involved in, many partners involved on that project. And I remember that the concept of managed aquifer recharge is not necessarily a supply side concept. It's actually an end-to-end concept which looks at 8 to 10 steps, understanding the resource, understanding recharge. How do you remanage the sort of augmented water? How does it connect to the ecosystem? So all of this is inherent to the concept of managed aquifer recharge. And I think it's really about how we pick and choose different elements of a concept and sort of, magnify them to bring about that change. Last 2 points really. So I want to again pick up from the point that Audrey talked about in terms of the uncertainty in science. And it brings us to this question we had from one of our very, very senior friends and somebody that we look up to, who sent us an email and said, why are you calling this whole series of webinars as reimagining groundwater governance? He said we should prefer the word improving, but I think we can't improve unless we reimagine. And in that context, I have just listed out 4 points on which I'd like to end. So one is, yes, when we look at established good practices that have, and there are many examples across the world that have stood the test of time, how do we take them to scale? Whether we need to take them to scale or not is another matter. But I think it's also about talking of those established good practices, which bring in all the elements that we discussed today. I pose this as a question to Margaret, but I think using science differently. And it's not just about pure sciences or hydrology or even social sciences, but I think it's also about how do we use science in a particular context, in a particular situation, in a specific geography to bring about behavior change. And last but not least, 2 points again. One is, how do we convert good research to action? And I think this is where Mihir was talking about the support structure where education and research can be a little more democratized than what they are now, and bring it to bear on the ground. I'd like to end by saying that I think this whole webinar itself was a great example of participation and collaboration. And I think all the work that Aquadam has done, and I said this right at the beginning, I'd like to end with that we couldn't have done all the good work that we did without our partners, without our mentors, without many, many people that we met on this journey of about 20 to 23 years. And I think all the flaws rest with us. All the good points, all the good things that have happened out of our work are simply an implication or a result of the partnerships that we've been able to forge. So with that, I'd like to thank you all. Again, I couldn't help myself. I'm very bad at a vote of thanks, but I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers, all our panelists, all the participants that we also gain from when they sort of pose questions. So a big thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you all. We will now be ending the webinar.
So that just before you conclude, the one thing I forgot was, I think all this is on YouTube. So people can actually look at the presentations, look at the discussions on YouTube, but we'll also be sharing a short document summarizing the series of 4 webinars, and we'll share that with all the people who had registered. So thank you again.
Yeah, so thank you. Good night to those in Indian subcontinent, and for the others, good day or good evening.